Hello and welcome to today's lesson, which is on Half-Caste by John Agard. As ever, the first thing we are going to do is we are going to find out some information and context behind the poet and poem. So the poet today, as I said, is John Agard. Now, this is the crucial thing because the poem is called Half-Caste. Now, before we get into the background of John Agard, the term half-caste, it should be said, is an offensive term to used or directed at someone who comes from two different backgrounds and whose racial makeup, one parent would usually be white and the other usually black. Now, the preferred term, or the as it were, the politically correct term that you should use as to avoid offending someone is mixed race, because the term mixed race doesn't infer that you are a lesser person. So this next bit of context is really crucial to that key message about the term half-caste. After all, this entire poem is really a critique of the term half-caste. So his father was from the Caribbean and his mother was Portuguese. Obviously his Portuguese mother would be racially what you'd consider white, and obviously his father would be considered black. Thus John Agard is himself mixed race. So he has a direct experience of what it's like to be mixed race and experienced certain prejudice and certainly felt frustration at how he was treated and the use of this term. So he was born in Guyana in 1949, which is a country, it's very close to Jamaica, and we'll actually hear from John Agard today, and perhaps his accent people would generally consider to be close to a Jamaican accent that many of you would be familiar with. So in 1977 he moved to Britain and was annoyed at people referring to him as half-caste. He felt that it was an offensive term, and again, as I said earlier, if people were to refer to his race, then they should refer to him as being mixed race, not that he should be labelled at all, but if people are going to refer to it, they should use the term mixed race rather than half-caste. And we're going to get into the detail of the poem, and that really specifies why he particularly thinks that the term half-caste is both wrong and just outright stupid. Now, normally at this point, I would read through the poem. Now, as you can see from the poem, the word you and how it's spelled, the poem uses a dialect, which means it's deliberately written in a way that evokes a certain accent, and it is read by John Agard in his Guyanese accent, and rather than me attempting that accent, I'm going to hand things over to John Agard, and we're going to watch a short video now that's taken from BBC, all rights to the BBC before any lawyers arrive, which is actually a dramatic performance of the poem.
Excuse me standing on one leg. I'm half-caste. Explain yourself what you mean when you say half-caste. You mean when Picasso mixed red and green is a half-caste canvas? Explain yourself what you mean when you say half-caste. You mean when light and shadow mix in the sky is a half-caste weather? Well, in that case, England weather nearly always half-caste. In fact, Some of them cloud half-caste till them overcast, so spiteful them don't want the sun pass harass. Explain yourself what you mean when you say half-caste. You mean when Tchaikovsky sit down at that piano and mix a black key with a white key is a half-caste symphony. Explain yourself what you mean. I'm listening to you with the keen half of my ear. I'm looking at you with the keen half of my eye. And when I'm introduced to you, I'm sure you'll understand why I offer you half a hand. And when I sleep at night, I close half an eye. Consequently, I dream half a dream. And when moon begin to glow, I have cast human being, cast half a shadow. But you must come back tomorrow with the whole of your eye, and the whole of your ear, and the whole of your mind, and I will tell you the other half of my story.
Okay, having seen that performance, we are now going to analyse the poem in line by line detail. So we'll start off with the first couple of lines. So it says, "Excuse me, standing on one leg, I'm half-caste." So the first, or rather the third line, "I'm half-caste," he is declaring the label that others in that time period gave to him. He's saying, "I'm half-caste, that's how you regard me, don't you?" And it's almost a challenge to the audience. "I'm half-caste, that's how you think of me, isn't it?" And he ridicules the best way he thinks about the best way for John Agard of criticising the term half-caste is to actively ridicule it. So he says, "Excuse me, standing on one leg." So it's the idea that if I'm half-caste, does that mean I'm half a person? Does that mean I have to hobble about on one leg? And it really brings home to the reader how ridiculous it is for someone to be described as half-caste. And again, this might not be a term you're particularly familiar with, and thankfully now it's a term that you hear very infrequently because it's not a term that we should be using. But back when John Agard was living in Britain, he heard the term very frequently. So we go on, explain yourself what you mean when you say half-caste. So this is really important because, again, he's challenging the reader and he's putting, or perhaps not the reader, but the reader, those readers who were to use the term half-caste, he's challenging them to say, well, explain yourself. What do you mean when you say half-caste? So he's making, just as he felt uncomfortable when he was called half-caste, he's almost making people who use that term in turn feel uncomfortable. So he goes on and he says, "Do you mean when Picasso mixed red and green is a half-caste canvas?" So he uses the scenario of Picasso, who's obviously a very famous, one of the most famous painters of all time. Now, the thing to know about Picasso is he was particularly renowned for his clear use of colours. So rather than complex shading techniques, his paintings would use whole areas of distinct colours. Now, obviously, if we think about Picasso and art, Picasso is a very well-renowned, critically acclaimed painter. So he says, "Do you mean when Picasso uses colours, that's also a half-caste canvas?" So it really makes us consider, well, if you're using the phrase half-caste to describe me because I had a white mother and a black father, does that mean that Picasso creates a half-caste canvas? Is Picasso's paintings half a painting because he uses different colours? And again, it's an effective way of exposing how ridiculous the term half-caste is. And obviously, as readers, we'll go, well, no, Picasso, he's renowned as a brilliant painter. We don't think of his paintings as being half a piece of work. So why should we consider John Agard half a person? So if we move on, Agard says, explain yourself what you mean when you say half-caste. Now, we've heard this before, haven't we? So here it says, explain yourself what you mean when you say half-caste, and it's back again. And we call that an anaphora. So we call that an anaphora, and an anaphora is a repeated line or phrase, and it's really used to reinforce meaning. And the meaning in this case is don't use the term half-caste, or at least think about whether you should be using that phrase half-caste. So whatever scenario John Agard selects to make his point, he keeps returning to that point. Explain yourself. What do you mean when you say half-caste? Justify your use of language. Okay, so we go on then. You mean when light and shadow mix in the sky is a half-caste weather. Now, if we think about weather, and particularly weather in this country, where obviously we experience lots of rain, lots of overcast weather, where the clouds are blocking the sun, we would never possibly think of describing that weather as half-caste. So again, John Agard is making that point that if you wouldn't describe weather as being half because it's a mixture of cloud and sun, then don't call me half-caste. But obviously he could make his point about racism, or rather the use of racially offensive terms in a really strictly serious way, but he's actually using humour to get across his points here. So he says, well, in that case, England weather nearly always half-caste. He's saying, well, if it is the case that a mixture of different weathers, like light and shadow and cloud and sun, are half, then England weather is always half-caste. And actually, just going back to this light and shadow, possibly there's some deeper meaning there as well. The fact that being white and being black carries certain connotations, and some of the stereotypes are negative, some of them are positive, and it's this idea of mixing light and shadow. So if we move on then, Agard goes on to say, in fact, some of them cloud half-caste till them overcast. So quite cleverly, he's linking the phrase half-caste with the weather overcast. And he goes on to say, so spiteful, them don't want the sun pass. So it's almost personification of the weather here by saying that the clouds are being spiteful by blocking the sun and not allowing us to experience positive, lovely weather. But actually, there's a link to those who use the term half-caste. Well, if you use the term half-caste, you are being spiteful, because you are actually causing someone to feel negatively about themselves as a result of your use of language. He's comparing negative weather with actually people who use racially offensive terms. And he says ras, and this is again goes back to the use of dialect. So in the Caribbean, where his father grew up, ras would be a term to express anger. So yes, he's able to use humour to make his points about racial inequality. He is also very angry, and that should be stated as well. So back to the anaphora, explain yourself what you mean when you say half-caste. So again, it's that challenge. Justify your language choice. And I suppose the hope of John Agard, that he starts off with that opening, explain yourself what you mean when you say half-caste, and we begin to re-examine whether or those who say the term would begin to re-examine, should they be using that phrase half-caste. And after each example, perhaps people who use the term are thinking more and more deeply about whether they should reconsider the language that they use. That will certainly be John Agard's intention. So we go on, similar to the Picasso reference earlier, you mean Tchaikovsky sit down at the piano and mix a black key with a white key is a half-caste symphony. So Tchaikovsky is a very famous composer of piano music. And again, he would be very well respected. Certainly, what John Agard is perhaps getting at is some of the people who use the phrase half-caste without thinking would enjoy the likes of Tchaikovsky, and they would find him to be a very, very gifted composer, and they would never dream of describing Tchaikovsky's music as half-caste because it uses black and white keys on the piano. So again, he's making that point, well, Tchaikovsky blends colours to beautiful effect. Isn't race mixing people from different racial backgrounds and someone who's mixed race is actually a beautiful thing, rather than something to be considered as half or cast aside. And actually the phrase symphony or the word symphony suggests a certain complexity to John Agard, that he can't just be defined with a simple racial label. There's a lot of complexity in his racial makeup, but also as a person. So he doesn't want to be defined in simplistic, offensive labels like being called half-caste. So back with the anaphora, explain yourself what you mean. And he goes on here and says, listening you with the keen half of me ear, and looking at you with the keen half of me eye. So again, if he is half-caste, he's making that point, does that make me half a person? So he's really taking that idea to its full extent and actually running with it in quite a comical way and saying, right, well, if I'm half a person, does that mean that I have half an ear? Does that mean when I look at you, I have half an eye? And again, he continues this joke and says, and when I'm introduced to you, I'm sure you'll understand why I offer you half a hand. So John Agard definitely thinks the best way to criticise the phrase half-caste is actually to ridicule it, and he's very successful in doing so. So carrying on this, and when I sleep at night, I close half an eye. Consequently, when I dream half a dream. So again, he is a complex person. He's a full human being. He's not half a person. So don't be. He's almost speaking to those who use that phrase and say, don't be so ridiculous. You know, I am a full person. Don't refer to me as half. I don't dream half a dream. So why would you call me half-caste? And you can see in that dramatic reading of half-caste, and it's always good to hear the poet themselves read their own work, he actually slows down here when he says, and when moon begin to glow, I, half-caste human being, cast half a shadow. So it's almost, he slows the poem down here, and it almost becomes from anger and sarcasm to actually rather poetic and lyrical, talking about the moon beginning to glow, the half-caste human being. So as I said, much more poetic here, and actually perhaps it's saying that actually race can be a very beautiful thing. The mixture of races together is both beautiful, aesthetically pleasing, and it shouldn't be regarded as half. I suppose the final few lines of the poem really encapsulate the core message, and he says, but if you come back tomorrow with the whole of your eye and the whole of your ear and the whole of your mind. So he's saying, come back tomorrow, have a real consideration of whether you should be using that language, that phrase half-caste. Open your eyes, okay? So be more critical of things that you hear. Don't just use language without thinking the implications of what you're saying. The whole of your ear. So listen to and take on board other experiences, other lived experiences. And finally, the whole of your mind. So again, it's that idea of being more critical. Don't be narrow-minded. Don't just digest the phrases that you hear and regurgitate them. Think, is that the right phrase? Is that an offensive phrase that I'm using? And we end with, and I will tell you the other half of my story. So John Agard here is saying, I'm a complex person. Actually, rather than just putting me in a box, let's engage with people from other backgrounds. Actually, have a conversation with them, and you'll find that they're very complex, interesting beings. They can't be cast aside like they're half a person. Okay, so we're going to sort of conclude the video by looking at the form and then the structure. So remember, the form refers to the shape, size, and number of the stanzas. So very interesting, the form is very irregular, inconsistent form. The stanza sizes have very odd shapes. And what I found very interesting when I was researching this is that the stanza shapes, the number of stanzas, is actually different depending on where it has been printed, which really suggests, because normally the form of a poem, and this is why we spend so much time analysing it, the form is extremely careful and deliberate, but the fact that it's different in different publications strongly suggests that actually Agard isn't particularly bothered about it having a precise scientific form, and actually it's really, really free-flowing, the form. It's as creative as possible. Agard doesn't want to abide by normal poetic rules, because actually, for one thing, Agard is known for reading his and performing his poems, so it makes sense that the poets don't have too robotic and formal a structure. And again, I think, or rather, too robotic a form. And this definitely ties with the structure. There is no real specific rhyme scheme here. There is occasional rhymes, but there's definitely, you can't tie the poem down to a specific and consistent rhyme scheme, which very much links with the fact that Agard doesn't want to be constrained by very precise poetic rules. And actually, this is quite a fun poem, quite a humorous poem, so that is definitely reflected in the form and the structure. Okay, hopefully you found that a useful video, and there will be more poems coming out in the Edexcel Conflict series. Thanks very much for listening.